9 days until we're 40 here today. Just gonna wait for things to sync. Today, go in portrait. No, sorry, this is landscape. Um, gonna continue on something I mentioned last video about equity rate. Might go over the head of a lot of people who may watch this, but I figured I should record this now and just iterate and improve on it over time. So it's been something that would particularly enjoy paying attention to in the car leasing business. Just how different, because we offered a flexible early termination uh, option for people. Um, it helped them really set their own cost of capital. It helped them uh, we weren't really charging interest. We were charging a fee for using the service of leasing. If you stop paying the rent and you pay off the vehicle, you basically reduce your cost, which is not the case on an interest-bearing loan. And this topic then leads to, the question of yield in Bitcoin. And just whenever we're talking about a new financial, the new financial system and what's possible. So I'll try to make some connections, but over time the connections will get better. I'll just share my screen and dig into the sheet that captures a lot of this. So hopefully this all works, but okay. This is a quick example of a car lease that, done traditionally and versus how we used to do it to allow for early termination, and the impact of that on the effective APR or rate, and how it translates on a curve. So I'm just gonna simplify this a little bit, but we're just assuming, let's just say there's a $10,000 car. We're trying to make a 10% margin on it, on an annualized basis over 60 months or 5 years. I'll just zero these things out. Let's assume there's no down payment either, no deal fee that we collect, and this is just the depreciation rate, and other items don't need to particularly worry about. But at a 10% annual markup, basically, you're looking at a $5,000 extra on top of 10,000, and the effective rate works out to be around 17.27%. Now, if you did this in an interest-bearing model or interest-bearing approach or yield, in a sense, you would have this kind of payment schedule. You basically just set the rate and you determine the interest based on the principal remaining to be paid. And essentially, as your principal gets repaid, the interest portion also goes down, but most of your interest is paid up front and then it goes down over time. And your effective APR remains the same, 17.27, and you charge it every single month. So you do gain equity in the car, right? As you pay down the principals. Now, cars are a depreciating asset, but as a ratio of that depreciation, in some sense, you get a principal portion. Like if this was a home, even you could use the same example. You would start getting ownership in the home as part of this. That's your equity in the asset. Now, the way we used to do it, and what this results in is basically this kind of a curve, where more interest upfront and then over time less. And then the way we used to do it though was we just did it like rent. Like you don't pay a different portion every single month for your rent, right? You negotiate that for the whole term and you just pay a fixed number, or your Netflix subscription or whatever. You just pay a fixed subscription, rent, or number every single month. Now the thing with that is the return on investment basically goes so long as you're continuing to make the payments. If you stop using the service and you stop making the payments, then the return on investment also stops. Now you can reallocate the asset, continue it with someone else, or have the person buy out the asset as well, and that's great. But the impact of that is basically the principal or your equity rate that you buy into the car or asset or home is like the same on every single month on an annual basis. Sorry, on a regular payment schedule basis. What happens though to the effective APR in this scenario? You actually have an increasing effective APR. So it starts lower and increases over time. The longer you keep paying or the longer someone stays on as a customer, the better your rate of return. This is a key distinction I like to make or observe when it comes to like, oh, is this yield or is this equity? Um, Generally with equity, you will always get a increasing return on capital over time. With yield, you're generally getting the same rate or you're charging the same rate all throughout, and you're not really looking for an equity stake. Might have to unpack that better later, but the impact of that is kind of shown here. Like, eventually, if you complete the lease or you complete the contract till the very end, you can get to rates that are basically the same. You will have an effective rate that's basically the same as you would have on a yield, but the flexibility and optionality that's available to you is much, much better. In essence, much fairer because it's linear. Your ownership ratio in the asset increases on a linear basis, um, instead of like you owning less initially and then own more later towards the end. Now, why is this interesting or important in the conversation of like yield versus equity? I want to try and dig into with like a Bitcoin perspective, where if you're assuming that there's no more Bitcoin, which there Bitcoin has a fixed supply, you can think of it like one big property in some way, and you're not gonna just like generate more property. There's not gonna be more property printed, and you're just gonna have to earn more and more share of that property. And there is the key assumption that eventually it will only go up in price. It may be volatile, but it will only go up in price. And is for what that allows is for giving up a much smaller portion of your equity. And maybe there's a bridge conversation to be had about like equity in a company in general, right? Like we talked about a car, and then you can take this to a home, but like equity is usually talked about in the context of a company, like it's a pie, right? Like you earn your share or you own portions of it, and your equity share can grow or shrink based on holdings and how much you give up or give away to others. And it's really a very, like, I don't know, in the past 100 years I think we've lost this concept because fiat and debt has just been so ingrained in our thinking, um, and cash flow and things like that. Cash flow is important, it's a different topic, but we've been taught to think in interest rate terms, and and that's fine, like that's what makes sense. But if you turn that off for a second, because if you want to work in a sound money system like with Bitcoin or gold and how it used to be done before, um, you are always talking about equity as a ratio, as a share. And you could just borrow fiat against your Bitcoin and pay a certain rate and, um, you know, call it a day. But you're gonna like the opportunity cost of like say paying the opportunity cost of paying like 14% every year on a loan against Bitcoin. You could be buying Bitcoin with that.
And what we're proposing or thinking about or engaging in discussion about is that instead of giving up 14%, like instead of like paying 14% in fiat that you could have used otherwise to buy Bitcoin, like pay a fee upfront, like share your equity in Bitcoin early on, give up a small portion of your equity early on so that, and then that equity portion will grow in value over time. If you give up, and this is where I try to, I'm gonna skip this. We're gonna come back to it. We're gonna do this all over again. Um, but I'll just keep this for the record. If you're like paying, like, say you were doing this Bitcoin bond thing like 10 years ago, well, more than 10 years ago, just the very beginning of Bitcoin when Bitcoin was like 30 cents. And you had, is that correct? I don't know. I might be doing something wrong here. Oh, I'm using a later price. Anyway, 10 years ago. And you paid like a 10% fee for getting this $341 loan against your Bitcoin. You're basically like, you paid $37.92 at that time in fiat terms. Fast forward 10 years later, you've only still paid $37.92. And your Bitcoin has obviously grown in value to $62,000 at that today. Uh, just assume it's $62,000. And yeah, you could have kept that extra 10%, right? And that would have amounted to like an additional $6,000. And this is where I haven't really compared, like, okay, what would how you have paid if you did like just paying 14% every year on 341. May actually be cheaper. So I will revisit this again. But there's a fundamental like misalignment, I think, when it comes to borrowing or lending fiat against Bitcoin, because everybody still wants the better currency. And again, an assumption, so I'll flag that, but the liquidation of Bitcoin is wanted by lenders. Instead, if you could actually just pay that fee up front to lenders, have them participate in your, liquidation. Not liquidation. Have them participate in providing you liquidity and earn a small equity share in the Bitcoin. Your cost of capital can actually be much, much lower. So you're only paying $37. You're only paying $37 overall, and getting a much better return. And the same and the same goes for them. It's like, sure, initially they only earn $37 worth of returns, but over time that just increases. Like they're because it's like an equity based approach, the value continues increasing and accruing, and it's not just a 10% return that you paid them, but like when you do the net present value calculation, it's like a 35% return. It's better than pay, like they earn more than 14% per annum, and they're not trying to screw you over, you're not trying to screw them over, you're just both aligned on this. Meanwhile, you grew at 110%, and the opportunity cost of giving up like this small 10% here at the very beginning, like 37.92, for all the extra interest that you have saved, you can just easily buy that back over time. And the opportunity cost is very little for this fee that you paid up front. Now the opportunity cost for the lender is higher, like it's almost double, assuming that instead of giving you this $341 10 years ago, they just bought the Bitcoin themselves. But the key here is that they're trading off, they're getting this upside from the fee that you're paid already, so that's what they wanted. And they're getting something else that we haven't discussed yet, which is they're getting protection from volatility. You're taking on all the volatility. Like, yes, it goes up over time, over a 10-year period, but Bitcoin moves up and down a lot as well. And you're taking on that risk. They're not. So in lieu of that, they like, this is a very rudimentary approach, and I will keep digging into this, but I really see how this aligns incentives um, best between both parties to create low cost capital for, you know, Bitcoiners, and just invite more and more people into the Bitcoin space and investing in or supporting a Bitcoin business, because they get that upside while also not having to deal with the volatility that as Bitcoiners are very much used to and deal with, like hodl through every day. Hope that made some sense to somebody, but I will improve on it. Thank you for listening today. We'll call it